Today is edition of Back Roads of Illinois. I'm Cesar Delgado. We're Central Illinois agriculture source, and in the Midwest alongside in Central Illinois agriculture, we're glad you're here on a Friday. Otherwise, we are watching for the World Agricultural Supply and Demand Estimate report on next Thursday from the Department of Agriculture. We were talking about that with Brian Greek for today. Then we go with Ben Brown from Food and Policy, Agricultural Research Institute at the University of Missouri. This is your commodity markets update and agricultural news. The Republicans will be passing the bill to ban from the foreigners to go to buy U.S. farmlands in the Midwest alongside in the country, especially since last year. Brazil becoming increasingly important to expand their beans. They're getting ready to start planting beans for this month. The Department of Agriculture announced for the World Agricultural Supply and Demand Estimate report on next Thursday at 11 Central Time. We were coming back with Brian Greek for Pro Farmer. Stay tuned on Back Roads of Illinois. This is your update on Pro Farmer Crop Tour for today's program on Back Roads of Illinois with Brian Greek for Pro Farmer with the Farm Journal. How are you today, Brian?
I'm doing fine, thank you.
Let's start with our conversation about your recent trip in the Corn Belt, and particularly in the west leg of the crop tour.
Yeah, so Crop Tour covers obviously the eastern leg on the from western Ohio through eastern Iowa up into southern Minnesota. The western leg starts in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, southeast South Dakota, down through central Nebraska up through western Iowa, and then the southern part of Minnesota. So, obviously there was kind of a tale of two different crops this year. Although the general conditions have been great across the Corn Belt. We did see some issues in the northwestern portion of the Corn Belt early on with planting delays, excessive rainfall, and those types of things, whereas the Eastern Belt had a much more normal growing season. There were some areas out east that had some issues, but for the most part, it was much smoother and great crop potential in the east. The western side of the Corn Belt had some more ups and downs than what the eastern did.
How is the field in Iowa, Minnesota, South Dakota?
So I'll start in Iowa. That's my home state, and roughly the southern two-thirds of the state are in great shape. Really strong yield potential there. So we're talking about the southern um, tier of counties, two southern tiers of counties there in the state. The northern third of Iowa. Obviously, northwest Iowa, north central Iowa, they had some of the same issues that impacted areas in southeast South Dakota and southern Minnesota with the excessive moisture and during the springtime, some flooding, ponding in fields, and those types of things. So that was an issue in those areas. And so, like I said, the southern two-thirds of Iowa is in great shape. The northern third, while it's not in poor shape in many of the cases, probably not what the farmers envisioned fully when they put seed in the ground during the springtime. South Dakota, some of the same issues that I talked about there in northern Iowa, and the same in southern Minnesota. And actually, southern Minnesota took the brunt of those springtime rains, the excessive rainfall, and the ponding and washouts and those types of things. So that area, which is highly productive in Minnesota, definitely won't have crops like they would have had in a normal year.
Did you get some reports from northwest Iowa about the flooding over and near Spacer, Iowa?
Yeah, so Spencer obviously had major flooding, made national news on that front and those types of things. It wasn't just isolated to Spencer; it was a big area in northwest Iowa that experienced the heavy rainfall. Uh, the crops in areas that where they were able to come up and um, grow, then they're in pretty decent shape generally. It's the flood out areas, the ponding, and those types that will keep the yields down this year. Now, interestingly, USDA has choices to make there. If they reduce harvested acreage, then it pushes up your national yield or yields in that area at least. If they don't reduce the harvested area, then you have some zeros and that type of thing across some of the fields and many of the fields in that area. And then you pull your yield down. So I think that the key here is that it's harvested acreage times your yield equals your total production. And total production is really what matters in the scheme of things, grand scheme of things. It's not necessarily your yield. And that I think is a critical thing for everyone to keep in mind as we move through USDA's estimating process of crop size, um, September, October, November, and then the final.
Did you see green snap?
There were some fields that had a little bit of green snap. Once again, I don't think it's a major issue for most of those areas. Now, keep in mind on Crop Tour, we travel along a designated route, 11 different routes on the eastern side. So that covers Illinois. And we stop about every 15 miles along that designated route. So we aren't able, we aren't into every field, obviously. We're into a singular field once roughly every 15 miles along all those routes. But we do make observations on the areas that we travel through. We did not see extensive green snap.
Do you have any final thoughts?
Yeah, so it was a great growing season for most farmers. Obviously, not all. The Northwestern Corn Belt had struggles, and that will keep things from being as good nationally as what they could have been, I think. But in as a whole, record yield potential for both corn and soybeans this year. Just a really strong growing season. We'll see how it probably isn't finishing the way that some of the farmers would have anticipated or hoped because of some of the late season heat and dryness after we came through on crop tour. But still, I would be surprised if we don't end up with record yields on corn and soybeans. I think to keep in mind, though, it's not about what the yield is. Like I said before, it's harvested acreage times your yield equals your production, and production is really what matters in the grand scheme of things.
Thanks, Brian.
You betcha. Glad to be with you.
This is Brian Greet for Pro Farmer on Back Roads of Illinois. We were joining with Ben Brown from Food and Policy, Agricultural Research Institute at the University of Missouri. Welcome to the show. We're glad you're here on the show.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
I was in Lafayette for the conference for the last couple weeks ago by Purdue University in Lafayette.
It was good. So this is the annual meeting of all of my counterparts from across the Midwest, and we get together once a year, usually in August, and take turns sharing outlooks about different commodities. The nice part is that most of the time we're delivering those outlooks on programs, producer programs, county-based programs. And so we don't ever get to hear somebody else present and give a different take or a rebuttal. We certainly get lots of rebuttal from producers at times, but it's always nice to hear somebody else and maybe how they would talk about a subject. And so that's what this conference really does is it allows us to get together and then hear other people present topics that we normally are asked to present ourselves and share thoughts and dialogue around those commodity outlooks. So it was fun. It was a good time.
How concerned for the agricultural industry for right now at the conference? How concerned for the agricultural industry for right now at the conference in Lafayette?
Thank you. So it broadly speaking, I think a lot of our colleagues, including myself, recognize that for row crop producers, this is 2024 and 2025 are going to be years of downward pressure, downward adjustment on both prices, margins, working capital positions of many strictly row crop operations. For those that are diversified with livestock, livestock is finally seeing some profitability, especially in the cow calf sector. It's been many years since we saw profitability in that area, and so for those that have cow calf operations plus row crops, we're seeing some of the deterioration from the row crop side be offset with higher returns from the cattle industry.
Could you tell our listeners how is the farm economy by the University of Missouri for last week?
Yeah, so here in Missouri, we are a pretty diverse state. I think that's going to be one of the things that really helps Missouri relative to other states in 2024 is we do have a lot of cow-calf producers. We're the third largest cattle producing state. And as I mentioned, there is some added profitability into the cow-calf industry, both because we're looking at relatively high prices still for calves, steers, and heifers. We have seen some deterioration in that market, but we certainly think it's going to remain strong in the next year. And then couple that with, the low corn prices for row crop producers are seen as a negative, but for cattle producers, that's a positive because it's cheaper feed prices. And so if we look specifically just at the cow-calf sector, higher prices for the product, lower feed cost, some sticky cost on what we would call those fixed inputs, whether that be labor, interest, uh, you know, equipment. Those are remaining relatively sticky, but some decent profitability in the sector, some of the largest we've seen in the last several decades related to cow-calf industry. So again, in Missouri, we're pretty diverse in the makeup of our operations, both row crops and cattle. So I think that's going to help us out a little bit relative to others to kind of weather the storm. If we're looking just at the row crop sector, profitability for 2020.
Do you have some concerns about the election with the export?
Well, so both parties have a relatively similar trade policy, and so one's maybe a little bit more aggressive than the other, but both of them certainly move away from the free trade that U.S. agriculture experienced in the late 90s, early 2000s when we were able to grow soybean exports substantially, when we were able to really find homes for dried distillers grains and other types of feed grade products.
Is there anything would you like to tell our audience about the crop conditions in central Missouri?
So the corn is coming off. We're in the thick of harvest around here right now. So corn harvest is happening. Corn yields have been relatively supportive. Of course, the growing season this year was pretty perfect for corn production. It turned a little dry down late in the season, but for the most part, the corn, growing season was about as good as you could have asked for. Beans are struggling. There's a lot of pods on the bean plants, but it's been dry in August and dry here in September, and that does lead me to be a little concerned that we might see pod abandonment and our yields maybe not as high as what we initially anticipated.
Do you have any final thoughts?
I would just simply say that for farm operations, especially those that are highly concentrated in row crops, those that rent a lot of ground and those that have relatively high cash rent rates, 2024 and 2025 are both going to be years of low liquidity, low profitability within the sector, and making sure that you're managing your farm debt loads would be important, and then looking for opportunities to maybe even um, expand opportunities into value-added agriculture. That would be something that I think as we look ahead, that's going to be important for the next cycle in the ag economy.
Thanks, Ben.
Thank you.
This has Ben Brown from Food and Policy, Agricultural Research Institute at the University of Missouri, Back Roads of Illinois. This is your agricultural commodity markets update on Back Roads of Illinois. Corn futures finished in up 8 to 10 cents. Soybean futures finished in down 8 to 10 cents. Wheat futures finished in up 4 to 5 cents. This time is for your livestock markets. Cattle finished in up 8 to 7 cents. Feeder cattle finished and down 8 to 9 cents. Lean hogs finished and down 7 to 4 cents. Crude oil finished and up 2 to 3 cents per barrel. Dow Jones finished and up 3 points. Thanks to Brian Greek for Pro Farmer and Ben Brown from the University of Missouri. We're running out of time on our show, but you can listen to this episode on YouTube and whenever you get your podcast. This been Back Roads of Illinois. I'm Cesar Delgado. Have a great weekend.